Okay, with that, inshallah, we will begin. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa salatu wassalam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Last week we spoke about why this is an important topic and some of the challenges that comes with speaking about history in general and about Islamic history. Also, we kind of skimmed over the pre-Islamic time, the time of Jahiliyyah, as well as we highlighted some of the main points of the Prophet ﷺ's life. And again, this class isn't meant for the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, and there's, mashallah, a lot of information out there that we all have access to. And I also remind us that the point of this lecture, at least my goal, is to really focus on not necessarily the information of particular events, but rather the implications of those events, or how the individuals involved in a particular event navigated through those events, or how they dealt with it, right? How they met those challenges, the framework, the ideas. Also to kind of look at Muslim society. How was Muslim society affected by what happened? How they approached new challenges, new realities. So as we go through these different eras, remember that if I kind of glance over a very important event in history, it's not because I don't see it as important, but because it's not the vision of this class. So when I talk about, for example, the civil war between Ali and Muawiyah radiallahu anhuma, I'm not going to go into all the details. I'm not going to talk about the battles and what happened, and I'm just going to kind of look at the implications and how it affected the Muslims in general. Okay, so with that, we begin the Rashid era. This term Rashid is actually taken from a hadith. So the Prophet ﷺ, in a hadith narrated by Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, and Ahmad, says that follow my way, adhere to my way, and the way of the Khulafa al-Rashidun al-Mahdiyun min ba'di, the rightly guided caliphs after me. And then he tells us to bite it with your molar teeth, right? Meaning the Khulafa, the rightly guided caliphs after the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ is telling us take them as a role model, right? So what exactly does it mean to take them as a way? Allah Ta'ala means take them as a role model. See the way they approached various issues and use that as a model for your own self, right? It doesn't mean that they had the authority to decree some sort of religious law. Right? So if Abu Bakr, theoretically speaking, who we believe is the best companion, if Abu Bakr were to have done something that is not in accordance to Quran or Sunnah, we're not going to say that's okay, right? Rather, what we're going to say is that he made a mistake. So when it comes to our fiqh, the way we apply our religion, it's the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. However, we believe that these four khulafa after him were the best manifestation of that. Right, so in their time, they met new challenges that weren't engaged, or the companions didn't engage during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So you can kind of take them as a model of how to focus on it, how to deal with it, how to engage it, and you'll see, inshallah, some benefits of that. So the term Rashid is actually taken from our tradition. It's not random. It's not something that Sunnis gave them. No, but we go back to a hadith for that. And the Prophet ﷺ also says in hadith narrated by Tirmidhi, follow the two people after me, Abu Bakr and Umar. He names them with name, and learn guidance, take guidance from Ammar ibn Yasir, and hold firm to the covenants of Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anh. And in another hadith, he says the person who knows most about halal and haram is Mu'adh ibn Jabal. So the Prophet ﷺ in various hadith really appoints certain companions to be a figure or a role model for something particular, right? And when it comes to the time span, from 11 Hijrah to around 40 Hijrah. Right? That was the Rashid era. And the rule is if you want to convert something from Hijri year to Common Era, or opposite, use 600. So if you're converting Hijri to Common Era, add 600. If you want to convert Common Era to Hijrah, subtract 600. It's approximation. So you have Abu Bakr, then Umar, then Uthman, and then Ali. So with that, what is our opinion of the Sahaba? Right? Of course, now I'm talking about the Sunni tradition. For us, when we look at the companions, our opinion of them is not simply a historical opinion, or we saw them as great people and therefore we hold them to a certain level. Rather, Sunnis believe that the companions, our belief in the companions, is actually theological. What does that mean? It means our opinion of the companions is rooted, embedded in Quran and Sunnah. So why do we love the companions? Why do we believe that they were the best generation? Why do we believe that they were sincere, righteous people who are following the guidance of the pristine guidance of the Prophet ﷺ? Because Allah said so. And the Prophet ﷺ said so. So there are many verses, many hadith. Here are a few. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in a verse in chapter 48, Surah Al-Fath, says, لَقَدْ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ إِذْ يُبَايِعُونَكَ تَحْتَ الشَّجَرَةِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with the believers who gave you allegiance under the tree. Right? And another verse in Surah At-Tawbah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَقَدْ تَابَ اللَّهُ عَلَى النَّبِيِّ وَالْمُهَاجِرِينَ وَالْأَنصَارِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forgiven the Prophet and the muhajirin, the Muslims who did immigration from Mecca, and also the Ansar, the natives of Medina, the Muslims who were natives of Medina. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forgiven them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in another verse in Surah Tawbah praises the first and forerunners. وَالسَّابِقُونَ الْأَوَّلُونَ مِنَ الْمُهَاجِرِينَ وَالْأَنصَارِ. Right? And also says that He is pleased with them. Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the companions in a way that is really the highest level of iman, and that is Ridwanullah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with them. And there is no higher level of iman than that. There is no greater achievement in terms of spirituality than to earn and achieve the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there are others. For example, the Prophet ﷺ says in a hadith narrated by Bukhari and Muslim that do not defame or curse my companions, because wallahi, by Allah, if one of you were to donate the amount of gold equivalent to the size of Uhud, or the weight of Uhud, the mountain, the weight of Uhud is pretty close to about Saddleback Mountain, right over here, similar size, right? If any one of us, after the companions, were to donate that amount, it would not be equivalent to half a handful of gold from the companions. Why? Because they were spending in the cause of Allah in a time where there was no guarantee. This, like a startup company, it's a very high risk. When you invest in a startup company, it's a very high risk, but the reward is a lot higher. Right? So similar concept there. So the belief from the Sunni perspective of the companions is that it is a theological one, and it's not simply just something we gave to them because we felt that way. Who are the best companions according to Sunnis? In a hadith narrated Bukhari and Muslim, Ibn Umar radiallahu anh says that during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, we used to consider Abu Bakr the best, and then Umar, and then Uthman. And then we would stop. They wouldn't go beyond that. And the majority of Sunnis consider Ali to be the fourth. Now some Sunnis, like Abu Hanifa, consider Ali to be better than Uthman, but the majority say Ali is number 4. And then for the top 10, the 10 promised paradise, that they are the top 10 in terms of iman-wise. So now the Prophet ﷺ has passed away, and the companions are in a dilemma. What do we do now? We need a leader. And they recognize this point to the extent that they refused to bury the Prophet ﷺ until they appointed a leader. Why? To kind of put themselves on a time limit. Look, the Prophet ﷺ's body is sitting there. We cannot take this lightly, right? So we need to appoint someone. And it was a dilemma because the Quran and Sunnah and the Prophet ﷺ really didn't say much about this. And this is a very important point. Remember, my goal, inshallah, from our history is to try and derive how the companions, how our predecessors engaged certain issues, or issues in general, so that we, in our times, are able to better understand our situation, how to engage it, right? Because, mashallah, everyone thinks that they are the bearers of the truth, and that they are the only ones who are on truth. And anyone who goes against them, then they are, an innovator, whatever, you put the names. So it's important to understand this. And what you'll find is that the way we approach the religion or understand certain elements of our faith is actually not the way the companions understood it. So this is their dilemma. Now the question comes, why didn't the Prophet ﷺ designate a leader? I briefly touched on this last week, but I'll go over it again and add a few more things. One opinion is that the Prophet ﷺ was a prophet and not a king. This is my personal theory and the theory of my teacher, that the reason why the Prophet ﷺ didn't designate is to make sure that people view him as a prophet and not someone who came to establish a dynasty or a kingdom. Because a king is very much concerned with who's going to take over with their successor. Very much concerned, right? But with the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't need to. Why? He is a prophet, not a king. Another opinion among scholars is that Islam is not primarily a political entity, rather it's a religion, right? And this kind of goes into the third opinion, is that the Prophet ﷺ was afraid that if he were to have designated someone, the companions would have misunderstood that to mean, or the Muslims from after would have misunderstood that to mean that this is some sort of divine decree. That, for example, if the Prophet ﷺ chose Abu Bakr, they might have misunderstood that to mean that Abu Bakr is the leader and from his descendants, right? So in order to avoid that, right, the Prophet ﷺ did not designate someone specifically. So these are some theories. And the next question is, why is there no formal structure of government? Or actually the question should be, is there a formal structure in government? When you look at Quran and Sunnah, right, you don't find that. In other words, if someone were to ask a Muslim, is Islam a democratic religion or not? Or is Islam more prone to a monarchy or a dictatorship? What is Islam? We say Islam did not come with a formal structure of government. Rather, what it gave us are certain principles and guidelines that we must follow. Right? For example, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands justice and good, excellence, being good to others. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تَخُونُوا اللَّهَ وَالرَّسُولَ وَتَخُونُوا أَمَانَاتِكُم. Do not betray the trust of Allah and His Messenger and that which you are entrusted in. Also another verse in Surah An-Nisa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُكُمْ أَن تُؤَدُّوا الْأَمَانَاتِ إِلَى أَهْلِهَا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands you to entrust people who are qualified for that responsibility. So Ibn Taymiyyah, on these latter two verses, he builds an entire political science theory, which I'll get to inshallah once we get to his time. And what you'll find is that there is no formal structure of government. Why? This is my theory. Because the point of government is what? What is the role of a government in a country or a civilization or a people? To cater to the people. The government is there to cater to the people, right? All departments of government are focusing on some element of society that's meant to cater to that people, right? And therefore, the question isn't, should there be a formal structure or a standardized structure, but rather, what structure best suits the people of that time and the people of that area? In other words, democracy might be effective for one people, but ineffective for another people, right? A dictatorship, right, might be effective for one people, but ineffective for another people. That's just the reality of human beings. And therefore, Islam isn't concerned with a particular structure of government, but rather an effective structure of government, whatever that structure might be. And you'll find that as history goes on, this transforms and changes, etc. Right? Why? To leave that amount of flexibility. And inshallah, as we go on, I will show you this. This will be one of the main focuses of this series, inshallah. So, government is meant to cater to its citizens, which differs based on time and place. So what Islam did give are the principles and guidelines, inshallah. So, how this manifested itself, this lack of structure, or lack of formal structure, I should say, is that when you look at the ways the four khulafa were designated or elected to their position, is different. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anh was elected through a shura process, right? Shura is a little bit different than a democratic process of election. Rather, shura is about a group of people who are seen as either seniors or representatives of the community. They come together and then they decide who is best. Right? This is similar to the tribal structures of the Arabs, right? As I mentioned last week. That when a leader of a tribe would die, they would appoint a leader who is best suited for that tribe. And they tend to choose based on the person's characteristics, especially generosity, courage, compassion, mercy, wisdom, right? That's how they chose. So the companions came together and they saw Abu Bakr was most suitable for that. He embodied that. And they knew Abu Bakr to be the closest to the Prophet ﷺ, And they also recognized something, which is an important point. And that is whenever the Prophet ﷺ would designate someone for religious duties, to lead religious services or duties, he would choose Abu Bakr. So we know at the end of his life, he chose Abu Bakr to lead prayer. And the companions understood prayer to be the most important thing in our religion, in terms of worship. So if the Prophet ﷺ entrusted Abu Bakr with their religious well-being, then we should entrust him with our worldly well-being and political well-being as well. That's the way they saw it. Now, Umar radiallahu an was in fact designated, appointed by Abu Bakr. So when he was sick and dying, he called the seniors of the Sahaba and he called people and started asking them, what do you think of Umar? What do you think of Umar? He got their opinions. And then once he felt okay with it, he appointed Umar to be the leader. So the first one was through a shura, and the second one was actually dictating. He was dictating who will succeed him. When it comes to Uthman was elected through what we call today a public election. So the story goes, and I'm being very brief here, that Umar radiallahu anh took the remaining 6 of the promised people of paradise. Right? It was Uthman, Ali, and Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas, Abdurrahman bin Auf, Sa'id bin Zayd, and Talha bin Zubayr, or Zubayr ibn Awwam, I'm sorry. These 6. Right? So 3 of them said, we don't want this. Who were left? Uthman, Ali, and Abdurrahman bin Auf. Abdurrahman bin Auf said, will any of you two step down for the other? Neither one said yes. So he said, I don't want this. It's going to be between you two. Give me 3 days, and then I'll come with a decision. So they agreed to that. So Abdurrahman bin Auf says that for 3 days, I did not sleep. And there's not a home in Medina I did not enter. So he would go home to home asking, would you rather have Ali or Uthman? So this is what we call today an election. He was going and getting the votes, right? And then the voting went to Uthman. And then Ali radiallahu an was pretty much designated by the public, as we will see once we get to the assassination of Uthman. So what you find here there are 4 different ways in which the leader was elected, which shows you the flexibility. Sometimes a voting process works. Sometimes it doesn't. Let's be honest. In the countries where it's very tribalistic, voting is not effective because each person votes for their tribesmen. That's the reality, right? For a democracy to be effective, for an election to be effective, people need to be unbiased, right, as much as possible. I am thinking who is the best candidate. Now, of course, they're going to choose someone who's probably caters more to them. That's fine, right? But it's not simply I'm part of this group and therefore I'm going to vote for that group, which America is becoming more and more like, right? You're either a Democrat or a Republican. And that's problematic. It makes democracy not as effective. So what we can take with this in our times is that we as Muslims should not be so concerned about a particular structure of government. Most governments, in the Muslim lands, want democracy, right? Or the people are calling for, we want democracy. Democracy has a lot of virtues, right? But we should think broader than that. We should think more critically and brainstorm more and ask the question, what works for us? Because look at the Arab Spring. One of the failures was that they're trying to apply democracy on a people who don't understand democracy. They don't, right? I'll be honest. I was there the entire time. Jordanians don't understand democracy. They don't. Doesn't mean they're bad people, doesn't mean they're dumb, but that's just not the system they were brought up in. Democracy is more than just a system of government, it's a way of life. And democracy is kind of part of the scope of modernity, which we'll talk to inshallah towards the end of the series. So we as Muslims need to appreciate the flexibility that our religion allows us and to ask ourselves the question, what works best for our people and our time, rather than can we import something that works for another people. So now it's Abu Bakr's time, and these are some of the conversations that are going on, some of the differences of opinion. Again, when we look at the difference that the Sahaba differed on how to appoint their leader, should give us a type of understanding where if 2 groups of people differ on certain political views or issues, that we could still get along, right? It's okay. It doesn't make either or less Islamic or less of a Muslim than the other. So some wanted a two-ruler solution. Some said that, the political leader must be from Quraysh. Why? Because Arabs will only give their allegiance to Quraysh. Quraysh was the hub of the Arabs. They were the primary Arab tribe, the most prominent. And this is something I forgot to mention last week. The reason why Quraysh rose to prominence was because of the event of the elephants. The army came, and then the birds were sent, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, Surah Al-Fil. And the Arabs saw that as kind of like a sign from God that Quraysh is the chosen people, or at least amongst the Arabs, right? So that's how they rose to prominence. So one view was that, look, the leader must be from Quraysh, right? Why? Because the Arabs will only follow Quraysh. Some of the Ansars wanted it, right? They said, well, it should be from the Ansar, because we are the ones who allowed you to come, and we are the ones who hosted you, and this is our native time, etc. Al-Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, said it should be from the Prophet's clan, the Hashemites. Right? So he had a little more specific. And practical considerations, Abu Bakr was more senior in age, in the 60s. Umar was in his 50s, Ali was in his 30s, really young, right? And in general, the young leaders are, they're kind of made fun of. People don't take them as seriously because they're still seen as not as experienced, not as authoritative, etc. So these are some of the factors that were being considered. What I do want to point to is the following, that the companions never understood the leader as having to be part of or from the blood of the Prophet ﷺ, right? This idea of a monarchy, that the successor needs to be from the royal bloodline, is simply foreign to Islam. This comes in later on once the eastern part of the Muslim world, or the eastern part of the world, start entering Islam, because they were accustomed to a particular kingdomship, that it's through the royal blood, and people won't obey except someone who is of royalty, right? The Western world, the Romans, were a little bit different. They were still a monarchy, but a little bit different than that. But in Islam, going back to Arab tribalism, it's not about blood. It's about characteristics, right? So do keep that in mind once we get later on to Ali radiallahu anh. But at this time, the Muslims were still united, right? This wasn't this boiling feud between them and resentment, and we need to grab power, etc. They were still well organized. There was no sign of eternal conflict until the civil war breaks out. And Umar and Ali radiallahu anhuma were loyal advisors and ministers to Abu Bakr. Right? Now, one of the issues that's brought up is that Ali radiallahu anh did not give his allegiance to Abu Bakr until about 6 months after he was appointed. And from that, people start spawning all these theories and opinions. But the account is recorded in Bukhari, and it clarifies it. Ali radiallahu anh, it's true that he did not give allegiance to Abu Bakr, but it wasn't because he felt it was his right. Rather, what happened was because of the hastiness of the issue, that they wanted to appoint someone quickly, Ali radiallahu anhu was not part of the discussion of who to come. And this is what he was upset about. He said, I am of the blood of the Prophet, I'm from his cousin, I have the right to be part of the discussion. Part of what? The discussion, and not to be the leader. Right? And it's well documented that Ali radiallahu anh considered Umar and Abu Bakr to be better than him. It's documented that he gave a khutbah once, or on the pulpit, he said this. So this is what he was upset about. And then Abu Bakr told him, he clarified, look, it's not because we didn't see you as important or not part of this. Rather, we were in a hasty situation. We needed to decide this, and that's why. And then they made up, and Ali radiallahu anh gave allegiance to Abu Bakr, and this was all clarified, and that made the believers very much happy. Now, it's important to point out the following. If Ali radiallahu anh felt that it was his right to be the caliphate after the Prophet ﷺ, he could have taken it. Because Ali radiallahu anh was from the Hashemite tribe. And the Hashemite tribe was more powerful, had more influence on society than the tribes of Abu Bakr and Umar. Right? So if he wanted to, he could have easily grabbed power. Easily. But it seems like that simply wasn't in his mind. It wasn't about grabbing power. It wasn't about he wanted to be, or he felt that it was his right. Rather, he felt excluded from the discussion in general. Okay, so with that, I go to another issue, and this is also a well-documented issue. There's a lot of information on it, and that is the compilation of the Quran. But the reason why I bring it here is because this is one of the most common questions I get asked. How do we know the Quran is preserved, right? What happened? And the Quran went through 4 phases. The compilation of the Quran went through 4 main phases. Number 1, during the Prophet ﷺ's life. It is a misconception by many people that the Quran wasn't written during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. That's not true. The Quran was written, every single verse was written in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And he had his scribes, such as Muawiyah and Khalid ibn Walid, I believe, and Amr ibn al-As, Umar ibn Khattab, Zayd ibn Thabit, Ka'b ibn Malik. He had about 10 scribes who would write wahi when he would receive it. And the Prophet ﷺ would say, okay, write the following. He would write it, and then he would command the companion to say, read it again, just in case there were any mistakes. So by the death of the Prophet ﷺ, every verse of the Quran was already written down, right? Also, when it comes to the order of the chapters, the surah of the Quran, and the verses, that is also from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Jibreel ﷺ would come to the Prophet ﷺ every Ramadan, and he would review the Quran with the Prophet ﷺ and say, put these verses here, put these verses there. And the Prophet ﷺ would then tell his companions, this verse goes in this chapter, and that verse goes in that chapter, this is the order. So the companions had the Quran memorized, and had it all written down, and they knew which verses were where. What didn't happen in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, that it was not all compiled into one book. So, then comes phase 2. During the era of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, a lot of the Qurra, the Huffaz, the memorizers of the Quran, were killed during the apostate wars. So Umar radiallahu anh was concerned. He said, Abu Bakr, a lot of these guys are dying. And I'm afraid for the Quran, the preservation of the Quran. We need to compile it. And Abu Bakr refused at first, and then he accepted. So what they did was the following. They gathered all of the written verses of the Quran and compiled it chapter, and put it in one place by Umar radiallahu anh. So by the time Abu Bakr radiallahu anh died, all the verses of the Quran were compiled chapter, right? So it's not one book as we have today, like a mushaf, but rather chapter, like that. But it remained in its original form, meaning what it was originally written on. So you can imagine how massive that would be. So when the computer was first invented, how was it? The size of a room. So this is how the Quran was. And then, in the third phase, was during Uthman radiallahu anh. And this has to do with the various dialects which the Quran was revealed in. And we have a narration in which Umar radiallahu anh was listening to one of the companions recite, and he recited a verse differently than what he had memorized. So he took him to the Prophet ﷺ and told him he is reading the Quran incorrectly. So the Prophet ﷺ told both of them to read. They both read, and the Prophet ﷺ said, you both read it correctly. It has been revealed to me in both ways. Now, with the expansion of the Ummah, you have all these people who weren't raised by the hands of the Prophet ﷺ who didn't really know this. And people started accusing one another of playing with the Quran and adulterating the Quran and changing the words of the Quran. And this became a problem. And it was taken to Uthman radiallahu anh, and he did what? He standardized the Quran into one version. And he sent that across the lands, and then from each city they started copying it into more copies of the Mus'haf, right? That's what happened. So Uthman standardized the Quran. Now there's a lot more details, but I don't want to go into it. The fourth phase was the placement of the diacritical marks, the harakat, the short vowels, verse numbers, and the dots, right? This happened during the Umayyad time. Now, some people want to, throw this against us and say, how can you claim that the Quran is preserved when without these, for example, these dots, there are many variations, right? And that's not really the case. The companions had the Quran memorized along with the written scribe, as we will see, I think, in the next one. Yeah, right, like this. So if you look here, this is a very old copy. And this is the one they found, the UK museum. They found a few years ago. This is it. On the left, the new chapter, that's Surah Taha. and on the right that's Surah Maryam. Right? So what you find is that there were some dots. Right? Where the dots weren't placed is when it's not ambiguous. If there was an amount of ambiguity that could lead to incorrect recitation, they would place the dots. Does that make sense? So, for example, in the English language, if you were to take a sentence and remove all the vowels, you can read it no problem. For someone who speaks English, remove all the vowels, you could read it no problem. Same thing with the Arabs, right? So that misconception or that attempt to try and accuse the Quran of not being preserved, that's simply not the case. Now, the verse numbers doesn't mean that the verses weren't already there. So if you look here, let me kind of show you. If you look here, you can see these kind of this pentagon shape, right here. These are indications that it's the start of a new verse or the end of a verse, and they would know the start of the end of, or the end of a verse based on the recitation of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet would stop at the end of a verse. So what happened later on is they placed verse numbers. Why? To make it easier to reference. That's it. That doesn't change the meaning of the Quran in the least. Okay, so Abu Bakr dies, and now it's time for Umar radiallahu an. And when you look at Umar, 10 years, he was known as a political mastermind. He was a political genius, right? Here we start getting a different model of political engagement. Abu Bakr refused to do anything that the Prophet ﷺ didn't do. Umar radiallahu an was a little bit more lenient, right? And now he is dealing with a massive expansion in the lands. With that, he is dealing with new ethnicities, new religions, right? Muslims are now going to places that they've never been before. The Arab Bedouins, right, who weren't accustomed to city life, are now in these cities, in these areas. They don't know how to engage with people. So these are some of the challenges he's facing. Also, the amount of wealth that's coming in is astonishing. It's unprecedented in the Arab world, right? Back in the day, you have a gold coin, man, you're rich. Now you have millions of dollars in our time is going and being sent to Medina. And the Arabs, living in the desert, we mentioned that in pre-Islamic history, there wasn't really no central form of government. The Arabs were there, they kind of did things. They had customs, whatever. We're okay. We could deal with one another through negotiations and through reconciliation and whatever. Now, that doesn't work. So Umar radiallahu an starts building a country, or starts building a government by placing or establishing departments of government, start designating more and more governors, etc., and starts making land areas. You're responsible for this area, you're responsible for that area, and starts dealing with how can the government now spend on the country or the Muslims in general, or those living under the Muslim land. So with this, you have now two things going on. The Muslims are dealing with new civilizations, and these foreigners, right, to Muslims, are dealing with these new people called Muslims and this thing called Islam. And one can see, even in modern history, when a foreign entity, government, enters another land, it's chaotic. The natives of that invaded land do not want the invaders. That's just the reality. Some of us come from such countries, right? But with the Muslims, it was something different. Why? Because, for example, the Persians, those living under the Persian rulership, they were pretty much sick and tired of their king, of the oppression and the unjust taxes that are being put on. And now you have these Muslims who are coming in and considering these people as equals. And the government is not placing unjust taxes upon them. Rather, the government is spending upon them. So what Umar radiallahu anh does, one of the controversial decisions for his time was, once they opened the land of Iraq and Persia, you have this massive amount of land that's there. Now, normally this land will be split as booty of war to the soldiers who fought and conquered that land. Umar radiallahu anh, thinking ahead, saw a problem with that. He said, if these generals and these soldiers now have possession of these lands, they're going to start renting it out to the natives of that land and to people who did not have the opportunity. And thus, wealth is going to go where? All the wealth are going to go to a small group of people. So Umar radiallahu anh, being very much scholarly and understanding of Islamic law, looks to a verse, كَيْ لَا يَكُونَ دُولَةً بَيْنَ الْأَغْنِيَاءِ مِنْكُمْ, so that wealth is not, booty of war is distributed in a certain way, so that wealth doesn't become confined within a certain sector of society. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. So what he did was the following. He said, this land is the government's land, right? And the revenue that comes from that land, the government is going to use to give to the people, right? So if someone were to work on the land, they are paying rent to the government, and then the government would use it again to fund the land itself, right? This way, the wealth is now being distributed. Now, imagine you are, living a native Persian or Persian native, and you are accustomed to a monarchy that's pretty much taking your land, taking money from you, right, so that you can work on the land, and that's it. And now you have these people who are coming and saying, okay, you stay here, do what you're doing, and then the government's going to take care of you. That's pretty cool, right? So they were very much liking what was going on and the changes. Also, something Umar radiallahu anh did is he started making these diwan systems. Now, diwan, you can say departments. And where he gets this idea from is actually from the Sassanid Empire, the Persians themselves. They had this system. So Umar radiallahu anh imported that system, started using it. And you find that the companions did that. So Muawiyah radiallahu anh, when he was the governor of Syria, he was observing the Romans and what they're doing, how they set up their borders, for example, their government, and it was actually importing these ideas. And what does this tell you? That we too can do that. So now you have two elements here. We started off saying that the companions kind of built they kind of critically thought how we can elect someone. And I mentioned that we as Muslims should be open to making our own system. At the same time, there's nothing ethically wrong with importing ideas to our government as well. So it's about a balance between the two. And what you find is that later in Islamic history, Muslims become very neglected, and they don't want to import new ideas coming out of Europe, the Renaissance in Europe. And that starts kind of leading to the downfall of Islamic innovation or the innovation of the Muslim world. So it's about the balance. Yes, we can look and observe and take things that are effective and work and use it for ourselves. Nothing un-Islamic about that. But at the same time, we shouldn't be so confining to ourselves to say that, we have to do it this way, right? One way. So now you have a central government being established. I went over some of these. Remember, the Romans and the Persians had lorded it over them. The natives of those lands that were conquered treated them like trash for centuries. Now it was time for their time to get back, right? So when a people are oppressed and a foreign entity comes, those oppressed people tend to ally with who? The foreigners, right? Why? Because we want to get revenge. And subhanAllah, the Quran actually mentions this. And it mentions it on quoting the Queen Sheba. إِنَّ الْمُلُوكِ إِذَا دَخَلُوا قَرْيَةً أَفْسَدُوهَا وَجَعَلُوا عِزَّةَ أَهْلِهَا أَذِلَّةً. The kings, if they enter a city, right, they cause mischief, and they make the lowest, those on the lower end of the hierarchy, the highest, and then the higher ones lower. They flip the social structure. And that's what colonists did in the Muslim world once we get there, right? We'll save it for then. Now, Umar radiallahu anh did receive some resistance from the companions. Bilal ibn Rabah was very upset with Umar radiallahu anh's decision, right? He was part of those armies. He said, look, Allah has made this our right. He says it in the Quran, right? Why are you doing that? But Umar radiallahu anh did not give in to their demands. And we see now that he was right. Okay, so Umar radiallahu anh is assassinated, he passes away, and we know how Uthman radiallahu anh is elected. Uthman was the Khalifa for 12 years, the longest of the 4. Now, the first 6 years were very much stable. It was the second half of his Khilafah, things started shaking up. Now, Uthman radiallahu anh started doing things that were different than his prior predecessors, right? For example, Uthman was very wealthy. We know this. He was very wealthy. So Uthman, every day he comes out, he's wearing new garments. That's his wealth. And imagine someone every day they're wearing something new. They don't wear the same thing twice. This is Uthman. Right? Is that haram? It's not haram. But people start resenting that. What are you doing? You're not like Abu Bakr and Umar. He also starts doing some things differently. For example, when he did Hajj, he did not combine prayers or did not shorten prayers. He actually established the prayers as someone would do in their residency. People start accusing, that's not part of the Sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ did it differently. Another thing that really causes a lot of resentment is that Uthman radiallahu anh starts appointing his tribe. Uthman is from the Umayyads. And he's now appointing Umayyads as governors, across the Muslim world as governors. Right? And they perceive him as doing favors for them. Now, to Uthman's argument, he says, look, these Umayyads were used by the Prophet ﷺ, by Abu Bakr and Umar. I'm doing what they are doing. But, their accusation was, but they're still part of your tribe. Abu Bakr and Umar were very keen on making sure that they don't appoint someone who is close to them. So when Umar radiallahu anh was assassinated, people suggested that he appoints his son, Ibn Umar, as the Khalifa, right? And his response was, it's enough on the Day of Judgment for the family of Khattab to only have one Khalifa. That's enough, right? But he has more on his mind, right? So Uthman radiallahu anh is being accused of nepotism. Nepotism is, choosing your family as to run the government. So you have mild critics from the senior companions like Ali, Talha, Zubayr, Aisha radiallahu anha, the Ansar, etc. Right? So now you start seeing this kind of resentment. It's building up. And remember, now you have all these lands from the west, north, and east, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, who a new generation is coming up who weren't raised by the Prophet ﷺ. Uthman, to the companions, is Uthman. He married two of the Prophet ﷺ's daughters, right? But to these people, he's just Uthman. So word starts getting around, and people don't like what's happening. So once this boils at the 12th year, you have a movement to overthrow Uthman. People are really upset, and they want to overthrow Uthman. So you have 500 rebels coming from Iraq and Egypt, when in fact it's actually Iraq, Egypt, and Syria. So these three lands, a movement against Uthman starts. But the reason why it's only Iraq and Egypt are mentioned is because Muawiyah radiallahu anh, remember, he was learning from the Romans and their borders. Now, the Romans are a very old society, a very old civilization. You're talking about 2,500 years, 2,600 years now, if not more, that they have a civilization. So they are very well advanced or developed when it comes to government. So Uthman, Muawiyah radiallahu anha, had actual borders, and he had an intelligence agency, right? He had people checking up on society, making sure what's going on. The rebels from Syria were stopped by the government of Muawiyah, whereas the other two areas, not being as developed, they made it through. So you had about 500 rebels reach Medina. They siege the caliph's home, and Dr. Uwayman has a theory that they never intended to kill Uthman. Rather, in the heat of the argument, someone attacked, and he was killed, right? And these people, it was probably around 5 people who entered the home of Uthman and did this, right? It wasn't known who they were. So they made their way back into the ranks of the Muslims, the commoners, right? No one knew what happened, and people are upset. And these same rebels end up doing what? They go to Ali radiallahu anh and say, we want you as the Khalifa. And Ali accepts it. So remember, public designation. He was publicly designated and he accepted. Now, this is where things get out of hand, right? Companions are looking at this, some companions, especially the Umayyads, the cousins, the relatives of Uthman radiallahu anh, they're looking at this and they see Ali didn't defend Uthman before, and now he's accepting this. Well, this draws some questions, right? So this leads to the following. You have 4 groups that arise. You have Ali's position, right? And that is, he is a legitimate leader. Therefore, he is the one who must, people must be obedient to him, give him allegiance. Afterwards, they'll deal with what happened. Right? Talha, Zubair, and Aisha radiallahu anha said, you know what, we acknowledge you're the Khalifa, but you're not doing what you're supposed to do. These people killed the Khalifa. They need to be held accountable, right? And what your decisions causing disunity between the Muslims. So they had a group. And the way to reunite the Muslims by punishing the assassins. The Umayyads, led by Muawiyah radiallahu anh, the governor of Syria, accuses Ali of failing to protect Uthman. And not only that, they start accusing him of conspiring to kill Uthman. They're considering, look, you didn't defend before, and now you're accepting this. They go directly to you. This seems like a coup, right? It seems like you are actually, you wanted this to happen. So we refuse to give you allegiance, and you are not a legitimate leader of ours until you do what you're supposed to do. Now, the Umayyads say that, look, the Quran says, وَمَنْ قُتِلَ مَظْلُومًا فَقَدْ جَعَلْنَا لِوَلِيِّهِ سُلْطَانًا فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ. Whoever is killed unjustly, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them the authority to carry out the justice. So in Islamic law, if a person is killed or murdered, right, it's the family of the victim who gets to decide whether they want to carry out the capital punishment or not. So if the government catches the criminal, they'll go to the family and say, what do you want? Do you want him to be executed, the murderer to be executed, or will you accept blood money, or are you willing to forgive them? And this is by what? The Quran. So the Umayyads are saying, Muawiyah is saying, he's my cousin, I'm the closest relative to him, the Quran gives me authority for this, and I am demanding the punishment of his killers. Ali radiallahu anhu is saying, no, give me allegiance first and then we can sort it out. Also, what Ali radiallahu anhu is saying is that I don't know who the killer is. If you can show me the killer, I'm more than happy to do it. But I am not going to accuse people without evidence and then kill them because of your claim. So what you find here is that the two main groups, the Umayyads and Ali radiallahu anhu, they have their opinions rooted in Islam. Right? And this is why, as I'll get to inshallah, this is very complicated. It's not a simple black and white issue. There is a lot going on. And if we don't appreciate this, we can easily fall into accusation. And it's not our right. And then you have a fourth group, and they are the neutral ones. And this is the majority of the companions are here. They were either here in the neutral group or with Ali radiallahu anh. Some of the companions were with Muawiyah. So you have this happening. You have these four groups. Ali radiallahu anh makes a claim, by not supporting me unconditionally, you have strengthened the hands of the rebels who are widespread, who are in my ranks, and who I cannot bring to justice until I establish my authority. Right? So you have this going on. This isn't the best Venn diagram, but this is what's going on. And the reason why they're overlapping is to make the following point. Muawiyah radiallahu anh never declined Ali's right to the Khilafah. Nor was he fighting Ali because he wanted the Khilafah. He wanted the blood of Uthman to be avenged. Right? It was never about him being the Khalifa. It will eventually turn that way, as I'll explain to, inshallah, towards the end of the session. So you have these groups. You have Aisha, Talha, and Zubair, who are accusing Ali. And then Ali had some of the companions like Ammar. You have some of the senior companions join Ali radiallahu anh to punish the perpetrators, right? So some companions say, look, I agree with Ali's position. We need to join him, reunite ourselves in order to find the criminals. And Muawiyah had his position. And then you have this group of companions who stayed out of the feud, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, Abu Hurairah, Ibn Umar, Ibn Abbas, and Ibn Mas'ud, a lot of the senior companions. Okay. So Ali radiallahu anh is killed after a few years. You had the battle of the camel and the battle of Siffin, etc. Again, I'm not going to go into these details, not because they're not important events, but because that's really not the point of the lecture. Right? Both sides agree that Uthman's murder was unjust, and I explained both of their positions. Ali radiallahu anh, his group eventually splits into his party and then the Khawarij, which we'll talk about inshallah in the next session. Ali radiallahu anh is assassinated by a Khariji. The people appoint his son Al-Hassan to be the Khalifa. 6 months later, Al-Hasan agrees with Muawiyah that he will get off the position and give him the Khalifa, right? So from here, some people will start accusing Muawiyah, oh, you had this planned all out and you wanted the caliphate and you stole it from Ali and you stole it from his family, etc. Ibn Khaldun has his theory. What's happening is the following. We need to ask the question, how did Muawiyah beat Ali radiallahu anhu? Again, I didn't go into the details, but eventually Muawiyah overpowers Ali, right? And the reason is the following. Ibn Khaldun has a theory. And that is Muawiyah radiallahu anhu was born and raised outside of Islam. And his father was who? Abu Sufyan. And Abu Sufyan was an elite, meaning he had a lot of connections. He had a lot of experience dealing with the Arabs. He traveled to other civilizations, other areas, right? And Muawiyah was taking and learning from his father and attending with his father. So he knew Arabs. He knew how to socialize with them. He knew what attracts them. So Muawiyah radiallahu anh was able to win over society. Ali radiallahu anh was born and raised, or was raised in Islam. He became a Muslim at a very young age, right? Therefore, he was raised on merits, taqwa, piety, righteousness, right? He did not have as much experience dealing with the Arabs. And that's why when you look at Iraq and what happened and his people, those who were with him, were very much all over the place. Right? And there, it's said that he said, I have you to deal with, pretty much criticizing them, saying, you guys aren't helping me at all. You are my problem, not anything else. That is why we are losing. So that was the reality. So with that in mind, by the time Ali radiallahu anh is assassinated, pretty much the entire Muslim world is with Muawiyah, with the exception of Iraq. That's it. So now Al-Hasan has it. Remember, most of the people who are involved in this are not companions. Most of them fighting are not companions. And they're not accustomed to the way of the companions and the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. They gave allegiance to Muawiyah. They want Muawiyah. We don't want Ali. This is what ended up happening. And again, it's not because Ali is less pious, but Muawiyah knew how to win them over. That's the reality. So Muawiyah radiallahu anh, seeing this, people are allied to him, not to someone else. He goes to Hassan and says, give me the caliphate. People are united under me. And it seems like Al-Hasan agreed to that. Yes, people are united under you. And the Prophet ﷺ praises him for that. This young boy is a Sayyid, he's a leader. He will reconcile between two believing groups, two great believing groups, right? So that's the reality. That's why Muawiyah, this is Ibn Khaldun's theory, that's why he asked for the caliphate. And Hassan agreed to that under certain conditions, and that is to stop bloodshed and retribution for Uthman's murder, financial and physical safety of all the Hashemites, and you have that, right? So that's what was going on. Now, this was called the year of the Jama'ah. After a civil war, after a few years, the Muslims became reunited again under the Khalifa Muawiyah radiallahu ta'ala an, and this begins the Umayyad dynasty, right, or the Umayyad era. It is important to point out the following. As I mentioned last week, a lot of information that you find in the books of history, Islamic history, whether in English or Arabic or other, right, are unfiltered information. A lot of it is simply not true, and a lot of it is biased. When you look at, for example, the Battle of Siffin, right, this decisive battle, it was the turning point, right? When you look at the information that we have on that battle, it's very little. We don't have much information, right? So what was going on is very complex. You saw how they were overlapping and they were separate, and you had these various groups and different things going on, and each group had their opinion rooted, ingrained, or embedded in Quran and Sunnah. And each one thought that they were doing what is most pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, looking at all of this, the amount of information we have is not sufficient for us to draw conclusions, and at the same time, the stances of these groups are very much embedded in our tradition. Therefore, the Sunni position on what happened between the companions in this time is that we do not speak for or against them. Rather, we say, radiyallahu anhum. Why? We were not there. We don't know what was happening. It seems so clear and so simple. Why don't you just join Ali? It's not that simple. Politics is never that simple. It's very complicated. And if you want to get a feel of that, right, look at what's happening in Syria. I think that someone drew a kind of a web of what's going on in Syria, all the different countries that are going, and who's allied with who, right? So, back then, Turkey and the U.S. were still allies, but the U.S. was allied with the Kurds, but the Kurds are enemies of the Turks, and it's just a big mess, right? That's what it was. And you could see something at a lesser level, of course, that was going on between the companions. The Sunni position on this is that we don't start judging people, rather we say, radiyallahu anhum wa radu an. Allah is pleased with them, and they are pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some of the main events of these four khulafa, Abu Bakr radiallahu anh stopped the apostates. The 2 years of his was really against the apostates, and he initiated phase 2 of the compilation of the Quran. Umar radiallahu anh had major land expansion, right, as I'll show in the next slide, I believe. And he begins to establish departments of government. Uthman standardized the Quran, and further land expansion. Ali radiallahu anh inherited a major political problem, socio-political problem, in which he attempted to stabilize, and that costed his life. So right now, remember this. When it comes to the Khalifa, who the Khalifa is, his authorities, this is what you have. The Khalifa was seen as the successor of the Prophet ﷺ. He had that religious feel to him, right? And he had political authority and religious authority, meaning the Khalifa during this time was the highest political authority and the highest religious authority, both in one, right? And he was accessible by the masses and seen as a role model, right? That's who the Khalifa was. Remember this, because as we go on, I will show you how this changed and how it shifts, because this is very important, especially in understanding issues of diversity, pluralism in the Muslim world, because this is something that we completely, I think a lot of Muslims really don't know much about. This is the map of the expansion. It's not that clear. However, you have 4 shades of color. The darker it is, the earlier it is. So over here, the darkest green, this is the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The shade a little bit lighter than that is the time of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh. So Abu Bakr has apostate wars, he takes back the Arabian Peninsula. The shade lighter than that, this green right here, right, that's the time of Umar radiallahu anh, right? And then you can't really see it. There's another shade that shows the time of Uthman. And then the time of the Umayyads, which we'll get to next week, inshallah. So with Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, he's dealing with, you have Egypt now, you have Syria, and you have massive parts of what was Persia. Now, when you study really the politics of Umar radiallahu anh, you see how much of a genius he is, plus you also you start appreciating the justice of Islam. And I'll give you an example of that. Abu Bakr radiallahu anh forbade the apostates, those who apostated and then re-entered Islam, he forbade them from participating in these this military expansion. Right? Umar radiallahu anh, dealing with now the Persian and the Roman armies, right? He's fighting against them. He needed more men, so he allowed these Bedouins to participate. Now, Bedouins are not accustomed to city life, right? And they are very much Arab. So when you put them in a foreign land, they're not going to know how to deal with people, right? So what you find is the following. This is very interesting. Now, as I mentioned last week, in Syria, Arabs were there. You have Arabs there, and because the Arabs had a trade route to Damascus, they knew Damascus. And Damascus knew the Arabs. They knew how to deal with one another. But Persia was a completely foreign land. What you find is the following. Umar radiallahu anh tells the people in Persia, establish new cities. So Kufa, Basra, later on Baghdad, these were established by Muslims. Why? Because Umar radiallahu anh was afraid that the Muslims, not knowing how to deal with the Persians, right, would assert themselves and force themselves onto that civilization, and that would cause problems. So he said, okay, go build your own cities until you learn how to deal with them. But in Syria, you found that they integrated into Damascus, right? And it's quite amazing. So for example, I showed you the picture of the Umayyad mosque, right? Last time, if you remember, the Umayyad mosque. The Umayyad mosque was actually a church. It was the John Baptist Church, the Church of John Baptist, right? What was happening was the following. The Muslims rented it on Fridays. They were renting the church out on Fridays, and it remained for the Christians throughout the week, and they would do their mass on Sundays. Later, they purchased it from them. Imagine this. A military force coming, and they are paying you, this native place, right, to use their religious houses of worship. They can get along with them, right? Whereas with the Persians, it was a different scenario, so he gave them different politics. Build your own cities. Kufa and Basra were established by Muslims. They weren't cities prior to that, although there's a very old civilization there already. I'm sure there were cities established there in the first place. So this is what's going on. And the more you look at the politics, the more you're able to understand the fiqh of Islam and see how Islam won the hearts of people. So once we get to the Abbasid dynasty, the beginning of Abbasid dynasty, I'll show you graphs that are quite phenomenal. Right? Why people accept Islam. This is very puzzling. You know, we went to Iraq and we said we're going to bring democracy and people were excited and whatnot, and then it was a mess. People don't accept it, but they accepted Islam. How did the Muslims win the hearts of people? Right? It's because they set up a system. They had a system of social and a political system that was very much fair and just and encompassing to different ethnicities and religions, as inshallah I will talk about later on once I show you the graph of the political power. With that concludes the Rashid era. Again, I did not do justice. There's a lot of information. There's a lot more we can learn, but I don't want to focus on events that we can learn from other lectures or and whatnot, or there's a lot of information about, but rather I want to really focus on how we can learn and the implications of certain events, how it affected people. And the more we get into it, the more diversity you'll see and the more interesting, inshallah, it will get. With that, wa sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. If you have any questions, then please do ask.
Sheikh, so I'm not sure you're going to cover this in a future unit, but you keep mentioning the Sunni position.
Right.
So what is the Shia position of the events?
So I'm not an expert of Shia thought.
Right, but I mean, we know the obvious that they think Ali radiallahu should have been the first caliph. Mm-hmm. But do they have a different perspective?
Of course they have a different perspective, right? That's why they have such different views. So, again, I'm not an expert on the Shia thought and whatnot, but from what I remember, they believe that it's bloodline. But you'll see, we'll talk about the development. I'll briefly talk about it. Shiaism did not become a foreign doctrine or a formal doctrine until later on, right? And even Sunnism, right, this concept of Sunni Islam doesn't come until about the beginning of the Abbasid era, which I will point out, right? But from my understanding, they believe that Ali had most right because he is of the bloodline of the Prophet ﷺ. And I think, this is my opinion, that comes from where Shiaism really developed is in the eastern part in Persia. And this is what they were accustomed to. It's in the bloodline. That's it. Whereas Islam, the Arabs, that simply wasn't part of it. Yeah.
You were mentioning about the Shura. So how were the members designated? Were they from the elite people, or what was the drawbacks?
I wouldn't call them elites, but rather they were the seniors, the senior companions. Those who had most knowledge, had spent the most time with the Prophet ﷺ, or major figures, people the Prophet ﷺ designated for certain roles.
Was it to a structure or kind of what was it?
It was, not really. Maybe the Ansar, the natives of Medina, were a little bit more structured because they had a leader of the Ansar, right? So the leader of the Ansar felt that he should have the Khilafah. Until the hadith came in which the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-Imam al-Quraysh. Leaders are from Quraysh, for the reason that was mentioned, that the Arabs will only obey Quraysh.
In Medina, I know how during the process sometimes it was more simple. Was it during the 4 Khalifas where they expanded it, making it more beautiful, or was it like more recently? You know how it's just like more, I don't know, just more like bigger, as you can say, or was it just always
more beautiful in what sense?
Just like how like the structures were made for like the foundations of like the pillars and like how it's like
architecture you're talking
about?
Yeah,
the architecture, yeah.
Really, Muslim lifestyle becomes very lavish during the Abbasid Caliphate.
Okay.
In fact, there's a book called Debt, D-E-B-T, 5,000 years of economic empire or whatnot, and the Abbasid Empire had the highest average income. I mean, that tells you something, right? That's when it happened. Abu Harith.
One thing when you mentioned the different forms of selecting the Khalifa,
Yes.
I think we need to emphasize that the concept of shura was essential in all of these forms. Regardless of how you're going to come around to the shura,
Right.
the shura was the core concept.
Right. So shura is a, subhanAllah, shura during this time and during the Umayyad time was a word, to give you an example, how we say freedom here in America, right? How that's so important, so fundamental to our society. Shura had that same sense, right? And really, the Muslims begin to resent the Umayyads because they seem to be going away further and further away from the concept of shura. So yeah, shura is essential. But what does shura exactly mean? Again, I don't think there's a definite definition for that, but it really goes back to the idea that it's a collective effort instead of someone dictating or designating it. And it also indicates shura. It requires a type of intelligence, right? That's why they would be called, the shura, people of shura would be called Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd, right? The people of solutions and firmness. I don't know how to translate that. Right. So shura is a very fundamental concept to Muslim society during this time. Yeah. Yes.
I just wanted to know about the end. You can provide any books if someone wanted to read, more deeper into some of the different areas you discussed.
Yeah, I can get you a list of books.
Something reliable that we can trust.
Sure. So, were you here last week?
Yes.
So I mentioned Dr. Uwayman, who's really an expert on this. My sources are going to come from him. So inshallah, they are good sources. Let me send him an email if he has a full list of these books, or else I'll just recommend some of the things I remember he recommended, inshallah. I'm sorry? Oh, it's prayer time, yes.